We're up to mitzvah number 115. This is the first mitzvah of the book of Leviticus. Of course, the book of Leviticus, it's also called in Jewish literature, it's called Torah's Kohanim, the Torah of the priests, because the majority of the book deals with laws of sacrifices and other things that really relate to the priestly class. And the first mitzvah that we're going to encounter is the first of many mitzvahs of its kind, and this is the mitzvah of the Olah sacrifice. The book begins talking about the person bringing a sacrifice, and there are different types of sacrifices. And the first mitzvah that it covers, and the first sacrifice that is featured in the book of Leviticus chapter 1, is an Olah, which is translated as an elevation offering. But I thought it would be appropriate and worthwhile, before we get into the specifics of the Olah sacrifice, to talk about sacrifices in general introduction to sacrifice. We spoke about this in the past. I think it's very important to revisit as we begin Leviticus. Now, it's no secret that the concept of animal sacrifices is very strange for us to hear. To modern sensibilities, to modern ears, it sounds like a very strange and unusual thing to take an animal, a perfectly healthy animal. In fact, it has to be perfectly healthy. It has to be free of any blemishes, and to kill it, really, to slaughter it, and then to process this animal in a way that you're elevating it on top of the altar as some sort of offering, a sacrifice to God. There are a lot of things in the Torah, of course, we don't understand. And there are a lot of things that are very mysterious to us. And there are laws that seem to be maybe a bit outdated or antiquated or primitive, even people would say barbaric or cruel. And it's important for us to understand it. Is there something that we can process, that we can understand, that we can rationalize about this mitzvah, what it is really all about? When we talk about Messiah, of course, we believe that the world as it's currently oriented, it's not going to be like this forever. Things are going to change. And we believe in a very important change that's going to happen with the arrival of Messiah, which is a certain change in how the world's going to operate. And part of the Messianic age is the building of the temple and the restoration of the Davidic monarchy and the implementation of Torah law over the land of Israel. And part of that is the restoration of sacrifices, which includes regular sacrifices, the morning Tamid sacrifice, the afternoon Tamid sacrifice, and then there are communal sacrifices and personal sacrifices and voluntary sacrifices and obligatory sacrifices. And there's a whole suite, a whole bevy of different sacrifices. And we believe, and we've been talking about it in our prayers and praying for it and beseeching God to bring this about. We've been doing that for years, for millennia. And to say, and we also believe that Messiah could come at any moment. But we have to understand that means that we're talking about the restoration of sacrifices, animal sacrifices. And therefore I thought it would be appropriate to try to understand the subject in general. Now, the verse tells us that the objective, just the actual words of the verse, is Reach Nichoach. It's a pleasant aroma to God. Bring a sacrifice, there's an aroma, and that's a pleasant aroma to God. Of course, we are already trained. We know not to read such things literally. Of course, God doesn't smell any sort of corporeal qualities to God. We don't do that. So what does it mean, Reach Nichoach, a pleasant aroma to God? So Rashi tells us God's happy, so to speak. He's pleased with us, so to speak, because we listened to him. That's the verse, and that's what Rashi says. And I want to kind of do a little survey of what the other sages say about this subject, because I think once we're done with it, once we have this introduction, this general introduction to sacrifices, in the end, it will actually make a lot of sense, and it'll be much more palatable even to us with our modern sensibilities. So the first source I like to look at when trying to understand sacrifices is the verse in Devarim chapter 12, verses 20 and 21. It's talking about a person having a craving for meat. They want meat, they have a craving, and they happen to live far away from Jerusalem. Is it okay for someone to have some meat? And the verse tells us, yeah, of course, you're allowed to have meat, even if you're far away from Jerusalem. Take one of your livestock, one of your sheep that God gave you, and slaughter it as I instructed, and you can eat as much as you want to your heart's content. Now, if you read this verse or these verses, first of all, it's important to note that this verse is actually a proof in the written Torah for the existence of the oral Torah. Why? Because the verse tells us that we have to slaughter the animal as I instructed you. Now, if you look throughout the whole Torah, from the first word of Genesis to the final word of Deuteronomy, there are no instructions. But the verse says, as I instructed you. So the verse is telling us there's an instruction that's not featured in writing, because it's just not. So there is evidence in the written Torah for the existence of the oral Torah. So that's just a side point. But the verse is talking about the consumption of meat. What kind of meat? Just meat where you have a craving, you have a desire for some steak, which for most of us, that's something that we can relate to. But you happen to be far from Jerusalem. The Almighty expanded your territory and you're not in Jerusalem. It's okay. You can take one of